All right. First, I was expecting to present live, but I wound up going in for a triple bypass emergency open heart operation. So even though I'm pretty good shape in recovery, it's not that many days ago, and I cannot sustain a lot of effort without needing a break. So the best solution was to turn this particular presentation into a video, and then hopefully I will either do a Q&A or be part of the panel. So my particular section is related to the fact that I've taught 10 class sections of English 101 and 102 with AI literacy embedded in it. What does that mean? That means it's part of the curriculum. It is not a novelty. It is not just tools, but is particularly applied AI, so GPT, but also visual AI creation embedded into my courses to meet all the exact learning outcomes of a standard English 101 and 102, but facilitated with the tools of applied AI. And after 10 sections, including what I'm currently teaching, there have been a few insights, and there are a few insights specifically related to library use, ASK-A-LIBRARIAN and other. And I'm going to talk about two specific examples of GPT allowed in English 102, and it does require a few things as you see on the screen. 10 discussion groups specifically to train people on using it, integration into assignments, which is what I'll focus, as well as a syllabi statement that allows it. So I'm going to focus on how this has changed the relationship that in English 101 and 102 is very strong with the librarians regarding GPT embedded into it. So let's start right away. So one of the things I embedded specifically this year was asking the students what is their experience with library use, librarians, ask a librarian, and what is their experience related to using that as a resource, which has been going on forever, for as long as I've been teaching, 18 years or more. But how does GPT change some of that? So I'll talk about those insights as well. Because they will hopefully give you an idea of the horizon of where GPT usage may be of value for the librarians of any of the colleges at the Maricopa Community College. So first, before anything, the overview. So not surprisingly, library science is particularly agile and as a vehicle for information literacy, particularly open in general by nature of the profession to some roles that it may subsume and certainly have to do with applied AI. And the best I can talk to you about is there was a LibTech presentation that was put on specifically for librarians and included some of the ideas that are already being nested and grown in library science related to GPT usage. Two main outcomes from that, or two main takeaways, were that librarians can be ambassadors for AI literacy the same way they do with information and media literacy. This is a great news for me as an instructor because it means that reinforcement of the ideas of both positive, how GPT can be used as more than just a sort of smart search engine, but also another reinforcement of the ideas that you cannot trade critical thinking, you cannot trade information, disinformation, misinformation literacy, credibility literacy, hand it over to a machine and expect success. So the idea that was put out by one particular scholar has to do with the CLEAR framework introduced by Lowe, and you'll see references at the end, who works in there, and how it can be used similarly to the librarian's role in information literacy, thinking about SIFT, CRAP tests, and other things. And also that library science is already working on AI-related frameworks for higher education functions. So it's not so much a frontier as a border that's coming fast that can enhance the support value that librarians have brought. So for more information, see the reference at the end. So first, and this is again centered on that particular discussion with students on, well, what did you use librarians for? How helpful were they? And what did you use them for in an English 102? in the context of GPT that was allowed. So GPT was allowed in my, that was one of the things they could use it for. They could use it as kind of a peer review. And I wanted a discussion about, well, where do you think the librarians are not being replaced in any way, shape, or form? Where are the librarians of great student support older sources as of the last training? True up to GPT-4, we'll see how things change. And when I say GPT, I'm really talking about ChatGPT. SIFT testing, source credibility scoring, GPT did not help with that. So this was still a factor that the librarians, LibGuides, librarian instruction reinforcement, and all the English 102 outcomes that I cohabitate with the librarian goals were not being replaced. In finding instructor-specific types of sources, so journals, peer-reviewed journals, again, GPT was not a win for that. And I also use podcasts as a way to find what's happening in a career, and that was still not as effective through GPT tool use as it was in consulting librarians. And then finally, information literacy expertise. The goals of having information literate students, credibility literacy, the ability to evaluate sources was not impacted versus GPT. There's ways it could be used, and students did experiment, but it did not replace. And as you see on the right hand, there are some quotes that show where they use ASK-A-LIBRARIAN, where there were no substitutions of GPT tool application that gave similar results. So that's the positive. Now, 3 examples in the discussions of where librarians could be perceived as a lead in coordinating the GPT usage, crafting prompts with regards to finding peer-reviewed journals, especially for project-driven or non-traditional sources. So I had a student who was very much into cars, drag racing application, car modifications, and they did find some journals related to that, but it wasn't easy to come up with that prompt. So working with ASK-A-LIBRARIAN produced some of the results that made sense of what the GPT produced on the right hand. So GPT produced some journals like Race Car Engineering Journal, International Journal of Precision Engineering, but really the students felt more comfortable if they sought help in crafting those prompts, either from the instructor or in an ASK-A-LIBRARIAN setting. Prompts to understand for guiding students in unpacking jargon. So this was a GPT use that they saw crossover with value with the librarians, which is, well, how do I understand that I'm using the journal language correctly? GPT was great for adjusting to audiences, but this was an area, because of the librarian servicing of databases and their information science expertise, that there's also crossover there. And then a third one that was discussed was what's called para-translation, which is reframing structures or assignments or terms into a student's domain of interest. And this is where GPT was very useful. For example, understanding the schema or taxonomy of how propaganda works. One student found that by having GPT convert that into sports terms, they understand it with a better, clearer, more critically applied second-order thinking method. So these are 3 things that in discussions with the students, as part of that assignment of where did you see ASK-A-LIBRARIAN having wins, where did you see ASK-A-LIBRARIAN having potential opportunities regarding GPT, these are 3 that were high value in the student's point of view towards the English 102 goals. Now, here is a part that created a little bit of dissonance with what the role was for ASK-A-LIBRARIANs or reference librarians or library instruction, where students did feel GPT was more useful. And again, on the right side are some quotes related to where they felt GPT was better than the equivalent librarian support. And on the left is both my dilemma as an instructor, where I want to see critical thinking and not just using GPT as a form of search engine. So pro and con sources, kind of the go-to librarian guidance with regards to finding arguments, is being replaced by GPT functionality, by applied AI functionality. A great article, Dumani 2020, is in the references list, but realistically, what you can imagine is a GPT-related plain English query, search engine-like results for pros, cons, counters, and arguments enabled by GPT that, because of its smoothness, because of its overall apparent successful results, created a bit of over-reliance, similar to how Google first page of results did when the search engines joined in. This kind of over-reliance was a go-to for students. So students were going to find arguments and counters by GPT with little desire to use librarians or even any other stop and think methodology when finding lists towards writing papers. And I personally did not use librarian support because I have personal issues when asking for help on things. That was one student. They found that GPT allowed them to run it at their own pace as opposed to try to reframe with librarians. And that is an issue, as GPT functions as an easy plug-and-play problem solver for finding arguments and counters, a critical part leading up to the eventual course outcomes of being able to write research papers. And my English 102 problem stems from that, in that I noticed, and it wasn't unsuccessful. GPT was successful at finding arguments and counters, but the over-reliance did create an energy that was more of a cut and paste, find a rote list, as opposed to think, consider, and add depth to finding arguments. So this is an area where I'm going to walk through an assignment and show you how a librarian by nature would be a great student go-to, student support, but it's being replaced by GPT, ChatGPT functionality, Bing, and Bard. So here's an example of a homework assignment. Pretty basic. It's a scaffolding assignment that says, okay, you've got a thesis through a process, and you're going to now find arguments and find counters. So this is an example of a student who really just went to the technology last minute, applied no thinking, applied no editing. So if it's a 20-point assignment, this would yield them 2. They have an approved thesis, and literally they just pasted with zero thought, zero rephrasing, zero processing those specific arguments. Here's a slightly more sophisticated use of it. This is ChatGPT as opposed to Bing in the first example, and the results are not bad, but again, created that rote process, no thinking, no processing, no rephrasing. And it literally is a cut and paste effort with the categories of arguments, for example, cultural differences, and then a pretty much cut and pasted, no thought, no second order thinking, pasting of those results. So I give them 5 out of 20 for not considering which of these are strong. Why are they strong? Which are weak? Are any hallucinations? So results are actually not bad, but the lack of critical processing and critical thinking and the lack of using the best practices of information and media literacy are lacking here. So this is a better version of that, where there is paraphrasing, there is at least attempt to answer in sentences towards the thesis and support, 15 out of 20. But again, my one complaint here is that it's still cut and paste. So better, but not a solution. So what I'm seeing is the possibility of SIF-like opportunities with librarian collaboration to curb GPT over-reliance. I'm not saying GPT will be banned because the results were not terrible. There were some hallucinations, and there certainly is a mix of both good, bad, weak, and out-of-context arguments. But I do think there's an opportunity for collaboration, similar to media instruction where, and these are my particular goals, have a filter for improving quality of chosen arguments. So not banning and being realistic that GPT will be used, but I do want a process or at least a bump in thinking that requires rejecting weak ones, identifying hallucinations, and eliminating the usual suspects, low-hanging fruit. I'm looking forward to figuring out how to increase student filtering of arguments as a foundation for the research paper, with emphasis on complexity, context, and second-order thinking dimensions. And this is actually something related to what's being done for GPT functionality with regards to argument search engines based on applied AI and AI learning. And two of the ideas are to, the same way we add SIFT or CRAP tests, add analysis to the homework for finding arguments. Add analysis, and the article by Joshi 2023 is a very good example of adding analysis to the automation of GPT search engines. But the add analysis is again to force a pause and have students consider at the most basic level, are the arguments true? But more importantly, are they applicable or impactful, as opposed to just being a generic rote list? So that might be the simpler form that I may try to embed in spring, and will coordinate with my assigned support librarian. Now, slightly more sophisticated, maybe not ready for spring embedding, is creating an annotated ranking of arguments. And FALC 2023 talks about that, where similar to a CRAP test, similar to a SIFT test, there's instead of an annotated bibliography, there's an annotated support evaluation of dimensions and factors of arguments. And these would include localization. Does it apply to the thesis in intent and context? Context strength. Resistance to countering exceptions. Again, removing that usual suspects or weak arguments. And finally, some kind of scaffolding activity in these four things, including how does the argument resist politicization or manipulation in usage towards the context of the thesis. So not just looking at it as a stage of finding arguments, but adding a dimension of consideration. And with that consideration, hopefully, more critical thinking, as well as second order thinking with support, similar to the support we get from CRAP and SIFT tests from the librarians. So building on that, here are two actual sample ChatGPT prompts for arguments homework that, one, scaffold for context, or two, field of interest personalization. For example, in number 2, create a scenario where the strongest arguments for the thesis, the current obesity pandemic is due to the fast food industry, are addressed in context and ordered by their impact from the point of view of someone entering nursing as a field of interest and working specifically in the diabetes demographic. So this is a way to take a generic homework, how to get arguments together towards a research paper, and add the depth that would be removed by over-reliance on ChatGPT by, in this case, talking about the career field and a specific incident or demographic, in this case, diabetes. So how might librarians help bridge between GPT function and their standards and practices as student support, as we experience here in Maricopa? Well, figuring out or helping figure out argument quality detection. What are the dimensions? And again, we talked about dimensions such as localization, context strength, resistance to countering, resistance to politicization. But I'm pretty sure the librarians can also give me some better ideas, some supplemental ideas of where argument quality detection can be implemented in a scaffolding assignment way. Kind of like the LibGuides or library instruction, adding that dimension of context and perhaps how these specific arguments returned by a GPT list should be screened and filtered for how crucial they are downstream to learning outcomes beyond just creating a paper of argument. And this is a quote from one of the sources, Dumani, about the dialectical dimension, the rhetorical dimension, context of discourse, and other factors that I'm hoping librarians will be able to bring to the conversation in support of the outcomes that I seek with English 102. So just a brief list of examples. Here's some great references to start, ranging from the ideas of where GPT will be, which is as an argument and counter search engine, as well as some of the considerations for creating better lists of arguments, creating deeper understanding and critical examination of arguments, as well as the last one, which is a framework developed in association in the Journal of Academic Librarianship that has to do with that. So hopefully this gives you an idea of student point of view, my point of view, course learning outcomes, and how they interact or are diverted in some degree with regards to GPT and argumentation, and also the kind of callback that finding sources, ask a librarian, librarians are still the best way out there, and students did recognize that. Thank you.